Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, March 30th, day 541 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman. Hi, Lazar. Top of the morning, week, and Hebrew month to you.
Yes, that is right. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. Good to be here.
Thanks. Always a pleasure having you. Now, last night, as Israeli streets were filled with rallies in support of a hostage release ceasefire deal, Israel confirmed that it had received a new ceasefire hostage release proposal from mediating countries and said it had made a counter offer. So Lazar will fill us in on what that offer is. There are reports that in June 2023, there were IDF recommendations that Israel enter a hudna, or a truce, with Hamas. So we'll hear about who wrote that report and in what kind of context just 4 months ahead of the October 7th massacre. And Lazar will weigh in on the unrest in Turkey and Syria's new officially sworn-in government. All this and more when we're back.
I like what I do as a Jew, and I find it interesting and meaningful, but I want to learn about what's out there and how do the rest of our people connect.
You come in knowing some things, but nobody here knows everything, because everyone has had like puzzle pieces, and together we kind of make up this whole larger puzzle.
I think the Hartman Fellowship has impacted me as a Jewish leader more than any other Jewish program that I've done, because it's sort of broadened my horizon on what exactly it means to be a Jewish teen and what sort of Jewish teen learning looks like.
The Israeli military said Saturday evening that it had expanded its ground offensive in the southern Gaza Strip to expand a buffer zone along the borders of the Strip. During the operation, the IDF said troops demolished Hamas infrastructure in the area. And separately, dozens of airstrikes were carried out over the weekend, targeting what the military said was Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad infrastructure. The targets included weapon depot, rocket launchers, and buildings used by the terror groups, according to the IDF. Now, yesterday, Hamas published a second propaganda video of Israeli hostage Elkanah Bochbot, in which the captive is seen begging for his release, desperately pleading with the government to return him home from captivity in Gaza, where he has been held by the terror group since October 7th, 2023. The IDF operations, of course, are ongoing, and mediation efforts are stepping up. So, Lazar, there had been hopes for a ceasefire for Eid al-Fitr, which is the very end of Ramadan. Eid al-Fitr began today, which is coincidentally also, not coincidentally, actually the first day of the Hebrew month. It's all about the moon. So the Eid itself goes on for 3 days, I believe. And do you see any way that these hopes for a truce, for a ceasefire, for the Eid, for the feast, will actually materialize?
There is a chance. First of all, it wouldn't just be for Eid al-Fitr. It would continue for a number of weeks. That's what both sides are talking about. Where we stand now is that there's been an Egyptian proposal that has been out for a number of weeks. The Egyptians, their interest is to just end this as quickly as possible and to get to the post-war reconstruction. And they've been pushing for a deal which is similar to but slightly distinct from what the Americans' Steve Witkoff proposal has been. Egypt wants to see a release immediately of a number of living hostages, which will start a multi-week ceasefire. And with time, at least as of last week, every 7 to 10 days there would be another release, until by the end of that period, it could be up to 7-10 weeks, you would have all of the hostages released, and you would have the war ended. There would be talks about the second phase, and that would all get wrapped up as this release happens. Now, Hamas, through the Egyptians, came up with a slightly different proposal, where what we're hearing is that there would be a release of 5 hostages, one of them Idan Alexander, who's the last living U.S. citizen hostage. 4 more hostages. Presumably that would be living hostages. And then they talk about a 50-day ceasefire. The question is, how many more releases would there be within that? And what does it look like at the end? What will be the commitment to end the war on Israel's part? Obviously, Hamas, to go into an extended ceasefire, wants to see Israel being pressured to end the war. Israel, last night after Shabbat, said that it had sent its counteroffer. Its counteroffer is what it has been talking about for weeks, which is an initial release of more hostages, 10 to 11 living hostages at the beginning, and then, which is 11 would be half of the living Israeli hostages, and then by the end of a ceasefire period, a temporary ceasefire, the rest of the living hostages will come out, and there would be no commitment by Israel to end the war unless Hamas agrees to Israel's terms, which again is ending its civil rule of the Gaza Strip, disarming its leaders going into exile, and effectively admitting that it has lost the war and Israel can dictate the terms. That's where we stand right now. There is a lot of pressure to make this happen. But as you noted, there is also ongoing military operations which have the potential to expand if this doesn't happen. I should stress right now the military operations are not to retake the entire Gaza Strip, not to militarily force Hamas or defeat Hamas. It's to add pressure to Hamas, this pressure campaign that started with blocking aid into Gaza, to force them back to the negotiating table and to accept Israel's terms. So Israel's hope is to get an extension, let's say, of the first phase, another temporary ceasefire with another significant release of living hostages. That's where we stand now. And in today and in the coming days, we'll hear more about it as both sides jockey in this ongoing negotiation.
It sounds to me, Lazar, perhaps I wasn't following all the details closely enough, but it sounds to me that Israel is not really moving on its demands and expects that the military pressure will allow Hamas to soften its stance. Is that what you're reading as well?
Yeah, because Israel has more cards to play than Hamas has. The only card that Hamas really has to play, it had several groups of civilians. It had Israel's civilians, right? So if it could terrorize them with rockets or any sort of pressure, then it thought it could force concessions, and that worked as a deterrent over the years. It had its hopes for Israeli civilians to put pressure on the government to come to a deal quickly and not under the terms that the government wants, but that seems not to be working despite the protests. It has its own civilians that it can, try to put into harm's way, and hopefully that will put pressure on Israel to end the war. That hasn't worked. There's not a lot of international pressure on Israel. And now you're even seeing those civilians in the northern Gaza Strip protest against Hamas. So that's even more problematic for Hamas. And the last group of civilians is the hostages. And that's really the only card it has left to play. Some of them, of course, are Israeli soldiers as well. But it's the last card it has to play. And it's not going to give up that asset. It's a rough way to refer to it, but that's how Hamas sees it. It's this last asset that it has. It's not going to release it very easily. But Israel has many other cards to play. It has support from the U.S., wall-to-wall support. It has a much stronger coalition now. The budget has passed. It's not really going to be under any intense pressure from Europeans or whoever else, even though they might express some dissatisfaction. It's getting the weapons it wants, and it has restarted the military campaign. It feels like it's in the driver's seat now, so there's no reason to accept Hamas's terms when it can try to push Hamas to accept terms that are much more favorable to Israel.
I think I want to emphasize something that you just said, which is that the coalition is more stable now. And so any kind of pressure from the street has less potential effect than it did in the past. And obviously, it's no coincidence that Hamas releases propaganda videos of the hostages on Saturdays, which are typically the biggest days of the protest movements throughout the country. And so it sounds to me like what you're saying is that these protest movements are less of a card for Hamas right now. These Israeli grassroots protest movements are less of a Hamas card right now that the government is again stable.
Yeah, now we wouldn't want to imply that Hamas is somehow driving them or they're in touch with Hamas, but Hamas is paying attention. It thinks, or it was hoping, that during the days of the Biden administration, that pressure, domestic pressure and outside pressure would combine to force Israel into a deal that Hamas wanted and the government didn't necessarily want. But I think, there's really just you see that these protests are not having any real impact on the government's decisions around which type of deal to take, and it's not softening Israel's position. So Hamas, I think, should not be hoping that this massive protests are going to push the government into accepting what they say. I think they might hope that it does, but it's not going to happen. And again, international pressure isn't going to force Israel either. So Israel, very much, the only card that Hamas has to play is the safety and the security of those hostages. But otherwise, it doesn't have anything that it can use to push Israel into any softening of its demands.
Let's go to a short break.
I and my wife, we were mourning with the people, but because of the way that things have changed, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, there was a feeling that, and this is the substance of an exchange I had in dissent with another member of the magazine's editorial board, the kind of progressive movement, I think a lot of people in the progressive movement felt, well, if we make a big deal out of Jewish pain and suffering in the wake of October 7th, it'll be instrumentalized and used to justify the war. That's like a generous interpretation. And my argument was actually not mourning legitimates the war. And this is because people don't understand also how Israelis feel themselves to be in the world. That if you were able to mourn, then you also might be able to say to people, look, this, what happened is heinous and horrible. And there is another way other than living by the sword forever. But when the world's response to this is, you got what you deserved, and this is even a good thing, well, you only confirm the sentence that the whole world is against us.
And we're back. Last week, as you mentioned, there were several days of civil unrest in Gaza, and this morning we learned that Hamas operatives kidnapped, tortured, and executed a 22-year-old Palestinian man called Oday Nasser Al Rabay, who participated in the wave of protests against the terror group. This is, of course, the same regime that we are now learning the Defense Ministry's unit that oversees the Gaza Strip produced a document in June, just 4 months before the Hamas massacre of 1,200 in southern Israel. And the document recommended a potential long-term truce or hudna with Hamas. So according to what we're hearing in the proposed hudna or truce, Israel would recognize Hamas rule in the enclave and grant it something akin to sovereignty. So, Lazar, what can you tell us about this newly leaked top secret document called Program for Long-Term Truce in the Strip, and who wrote it, actually?
So this reflects Israeli thinking kind of across the board about Gaza before October 7th. The idea was do whatever you need to do to keep Gaza quiet. Even if it is, as we've talked about, funneling millions of dollars. This would be a step forward. It would be effectively recognizing a Hamas-run Gaza state. And what Israel would get back would be 10 years, 20 years, basically a generation of quiet, a hudna, so a long-term temporary truce. Israel would want this. Why? Because then they could focus on the Hezbollah threat and the Iran threat, and they could keep this kind of annoying Gaza problem that turns into rockets and campaigns every couple of years quiet. It is something that the head of the Kogat, Major General Ghassan Elian, promoted. He sent it to the Shin Bet head, IDF chiefs, Mossad, and there were debates on it, and it seemed like it was being taken very seriously as a potential solution. It would basically be propping up and seeing the Gaza rule, the Hamas rule of Gaza, as what is going to be in place for the foreseeable future. And in that way, to buy quiet. And hopefully there was an idea that this would even strengthen moderates within Hamas who want to come to these arrangements with Israel to loosen the imports of what's going into Gaza. So there was even tires for motorcycles that went into Gaza. There was metal that was used in the creation of rockets against us. If you think back to these images of October 7th of terrorists coming in on motorcycles, you can see the actual effect of how how Hamas was able to fool us by telling the Egyptians and making these public statements about a willingness and a desire to come to this long-term calm and to establish and deepen their rule in the Gaza Strip. Obviously, now we know that this was a part of a very effective campaign to fool us, to have us lower our defenses, to make the way for the October 7th attack. While Elian and other senior Israeli officials were talking to the Egyptians and promoting this report, by May 2023, Yahya Sinwar had already decided on the October 7th date for the attack. So Hamas was putting out these signals to the Egyptians. The Egyptians were telling us we were falling for it, and Hamas was building its attack plan. We were absolutely fooled there. I wouldn't say point the finger at one person. It was the entire Israeli system. It was definitely the Netanyahu government. It was definitely the Bennett and Lapid governments did not speak differently about Gaza. We had those 5 election cycles, right? There's 5 sets of elections shortly, one after the other. And it's not like Gaza was a campaign issue. It barely came up. So no one had any new ideas for Gaza. The ideas for Gaza were to buy quiet and focus on bigger threats. And now, of course, everyone is looking back and trying to pin the blame on each other. Netanyahu's trying to pin the blame on security services. The opposition is trying to put the blame on Netanyahu. Everyone's guilty here. I'm not saying what should be done about that, but the entire Israeli security system got it wrong, and we saw the result of this. But this is just another reminder of how deeply we were fooled and how deeply and effectively Hamas was able to fool us and the people that pay attention to Gaza, and really just read it wrong and didn't have any sort of plan or preparations for the eventuality that they could be wrong about Hamas intentions and capabilities.
Let's turn our eyes to Turkey, where hundreds of thousands of anti-government demonstrators rallied in Istanbul Saturday, calling for democracy to be defended after the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, which sparked Turkey's worst street unrest in over a decade. So we don't know how things are going to play out, and there was a report of even 2.2 million taking to the streets last night. I want to, of course, being the Times of Israel, shift our focus on how this may affect our relationship or lack thereof with Turkey. Lazar, what do you have to say about this?
Yeah, so Turkey has turned under Erdogan's rule into a democracy only at the ballot box. So elections still happen. If the people want to vote Erdogan out, that would happen. But he has clamped down on freedom of press, freedom of speech, and has found all sorts of ways to limit the ability of candidates to run and also of their ability to get their message out. So it's not like it's a full democracy. Now, when you're taking the most popular politician in Turkey, really the only person who could challenge and threaten Erdogan at the ballot box, which is in 2028, but it seems like Erdogan is term limited by then, but he could find new ways to change the constitution, I'm sure. Now that he is, by coincidence, arresting him on charges of corruption and terrorism, you even saw that the university where he got one of his degrees from is pulling that recognition, and you have to have a university degree to run for president. You can see that these are all ways to get rid of a dangerous political rival for him. Now, I think Turkish citizens, or millions of them, sense the threat. This is their last chance to really have an ability to decide on the future of the country and to make sure it doesn't slide into full authoritarianism. And that's why they're in the streets. Not everyone who is in the street is a supporter of the opposition parties, but I think they recognize that this is a watershed moment. And if Erdogan gets away with eliminating this rival through trumped-up charges or procedural issues like his college degree, then they really have no chance to affect Turkey's future. What does it mean for Israel? If Erdogan stays in power, we can expect relations between the two to be very bad. Erdogan has been a vocal critic of Israel throughout the years. There's been times when it's gotten better, but certainly since October 7, 2023, he has been a leading critic. And now with the Turkish-backed government in Syria swearing in, there is potential for proxies of Turkey to come into military conflict with Israel. It's certainly pretty fraught there, but whatever it is, we don't want a hostile Erdogan government in Turkey. It's a NATO member. It has deep ties with the West. It has good ties with Trump. And certainly it is very influential in the Middle East. Nothing good happens the longer Erdogan is to stay in power, but he's going to be in power for the next few years anyway. I think the only hope for the recovery of strong and effective and productive Turkish-Israel cooperations is for the opposition to win. But right now you see that Erdogan is doing everything he can to make sure that doesn't happen.
But as you mentioned, Lazar, the relations soured even more after the October 7th massacre that Hamas perpetrated in southern Israel. But prior to that, our trade relations seem to have been warming. And this new clampdown on ties between Turkey and Israel is really affecting the Israeli economy, especially, for example, the building sector. A lot of the ceramics, for example, building materials had come through Turkey. And this is a really devastating blow, another devastating blow following the October 7th massacre. So I do wonder if we can get back to that cold peace kind of feeling that we had before October 7th, or do you think that is just impossible under Erdogan?
The trade relationship, really did stay stable despite the political ups and downs. And it seems like the intelligence relationship remains good, actually. A place where there is actually a lot of agreement is over Azerbaijan, which is a very close Turkish ally, and a very close Israeli ally. So I'm sure there's plenty of back channels there and even meetings between the two sides. You've also seen some counterterrorism cooperation. But in terms of the, getting cheap and quality materials from Turkey, there's plenty of other options. I think Israel would be much better to turn to other suppliers. There's no shortage of suppliers. Even it could start, thinking bigger. You could think, okay, we want to strengthen our relationship with Egypt, which is a more reliable ally. Egypt's economy is really not doing well. If we could buy more from Egypt, you could think about Jordan if we want to make the relationship better there. And there's other European countries. The Greek prime minister is here today. If we could shift more of that trade toward countries like Greece, I think that will also be to everyone's benefit as well. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about other options, thinking big picture here, and thinking who we want to strengthen and who we have to understand is no friend of ours.
So, friend or foe, Syria's new transitional government was sworn in on Saturday, nearly 4 months after the Assad family was removed from power, and as the new authorities in Damascus work to bring back stability in the war-torn country. So, Lazar, as you mentioned, there's quite a large possibility that Turkey has its finger in this 23-member cabinet, but it is actually a religiously and ethnically mixed assortment of Syrians. So, what do you know about the chances for at least cold peace with Israel here?
So you're right. It has a Kurdish man. It has a Christian woman in the cabinet. That's all a signal to the West that it is now that Ahmed al-Shara has put behind his jihadist past. Obviously, we've heard that Israel doesn't trust this at all and is trying to make sure that people don't give him a pass and that they treat this government with serious suspicion. And just the fact that he's able to put together a cabinet doesn't mean that he has given up any of his Islamist tendencies. So that is something we're going to have to keep an eye on. Israel certainly doesn't want to give this government a chance at all. It continues to pressure it to be very aggressive militarily. So it's not like Israel is looking, to wait and see what happens. It is putting all the pressure it can on this government. This government in general does not seem to want to pick a fight with Israel in any way. It understands it has much bigger problems and has no chance of competing militarily with Israel. So it hopes it can put any sort of, ongoing fight with Israel to rest. But Israel, for a number of reasons, is not about to let that happen. What could happen over time, though, over the years, if Israel remains in a buffer zone, is that either Turkey or this government or Iran could start finding ways to start funding an insurgency against IDF troops. There was a couple of incidents of gunfire at Israeli troops in recent weeks. That could certainly expand. It always does when you have troops occupying not necessarily friendly populations. That could happen. We haven't really seen it happen yet, but that is always a danger the longer we're there. So it's unclear what's going to happen, but we do know that Israel is in no mood to release the pressure on this government. The fact that there's a new government doesn't change Israel's position at all. And Israel has presented itself as the defender of the minorities. We'll see if there's any more upticks of violence like we saw, more than an uptick, an outbreak of violence against the Alawites. If that happens again, I think we're going to see more aggressive Israeli statements and possibly even more aggressive Israeli military action as well.
Lazar, thank you so much for joining me, as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.